Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, and you have turned into your Alaska Weather, brought to you by the National Weather Service. And tonight is November 1st, 2017. Hope everyone had a great Halloween. And as always, if you need to get in touch with us, 1-800-472-0391. And from there, you can dial into any of the three offices, the Juneau, Fairbanks, or Anchorage office. And always weather.gov/Alaska for a regional perspective. And then again, you can dial in by using the point and click feature on our website. Just click on exactly where you want the forecast for, and it will bring up a point-specific forecast. And if you need to get in touch with us here at the TV desk, nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov is a good email address, and Mr. Dave Snider or one of us will get back in touch with you as soon as possible. So let's take a look. We've got a pretty busy night, pretty hefty amount of topics to talk about. So for our headlines tonight, strong westerly flow along the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline there, helping to create some blowing snow conditions. So we're going to talk about that a little bit on our hazards. Snow returning for the southwest slopes of the Brooks Range and eventually spreading into the interior portion of the state as well. Freezing fog has been quite nasty around south central and southwestern Alaska, hanging in tight around Anchorage and the Mat-Su valleys. So causing some headaches for folks driving around in those areas. And strong northerly winds persisting for southeast Alaska. Cold air mass trying to push through there, creating some gusty outflow winds out over the marine waters. So first, our fairly small area, but a fairly big impact with a lot of folks traveling through this area. So from the Mat-Su Valley down to the Anchorage Bowl, a dense fog advisory with some pockets of freezing fog, making for slick conditions, and that is in effect until 10 a.m. Thursday. We'll be watching for the continuation of that, possibly as some patchy fog into Thursday afternoon, but the dense portion of it should die off. As we jump towards the little bit larger areas of winter weather, here's a winter storm warning, and this is in effect for the mainly the southern slopes of the Brooks Range for areas north of Noatak. And this is going to be from 12 a.m. tonight until 6 p.m. Thursday. And what we're looking for in that area is 4 to 8 inches of snow, and should be heavier the farther north you get. A little bit more of a rain-snow mix near Noatak. As we slide a little bit further north along the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline there, this is a winter weather advisories for blowing snow. It's going to start for the west and work its way to the east. So check with your Fairbanks office if you have an interest in the timelines for those. They do vary again from west, dying off first in the west and then dying off later on in the east over towards Kaktovik and Arctic Village. And that again is for blowing snow. And then as we look towards the general interior region here for Fort Yukon and Fairbanks, there is a special weather statement in effect. And this is generally for about 2 to 8 inches of snow, 2 to 4 mostly in Fairbanks, and then a little bit higher amounts, 2 to 8 up along the Alaska Range there. And that's going to be starting late tomorrow, late Thursday, and continuing on through Thursday. So check your special weather statement for more details. How about our satellite loop? Well, you can see not a lot of weather going on today. Pretty quiet day across the state. These low clouds, or this darker color shows up. It's not actually cloudy in a lot of these places, but it does show up on our infrared imagery. The area that we're keying in on is this moisture starting to stream up here from southwest, moving to the northeast and starting to come over top. And so there's fairly cold air in place up here, and this moisture is riding a fairly warm jet, and so it's going to bring some heavier precipitation to those areas. For southeast Alaska, let's loop it again here. You can see that general northerly wind there. Weak area of low pressure spinning here south of Ketchikan now, but helping to reinforce that cold air being drugged down from northwest territories and down in through much of the bays and passes of southeast Alaska. So one more time for that. And you can see there that area of low pressure pulling away from the state. And otherwise, just those foggy conditions across southern Alaska, but not a bad day once you're above the fog. How about for the surface map? Well, you can see there why we have so much fog. High pressure at 1,038 millibars, locking down, sinking motion aloft helps to lock down the fog across southwest Bristol Bay and across portions of south central Alaska. Here's our moisture stream starting to make its way up here. Not quite here yet, but will be making its way up pretty quickly through the evening hours into the overnight hours, so we'll keep an eye on that. As we look towards the west coast, just a little bit of precipitation starting there. Kind of confused precipitation. Sometimes it's rain, sometimes it's a mix, sometimes it's snow. So just there, starting along the Seward Peninsula and along the YK Delta coastline. For southeast Alaska, there's that cold air just pushing through. Not much precipitation associated with this. This is kind of a cold, dry cold front, and with that, just expecting those gusty winds. How about for tonight? Well, pretty similar story. High pressure with that cold air pushing off towards the area of lower pressure. So you're getting strong northerly winds there and a reinforcing shot of cold air. Again, not a lot of precipitation, so fairly dry. Towards southwest and south central Alaska, you can expect quiet conditions, however, more freezing fog. Again, with that dense fog advisory in effect until 10 a.m. tomorrow. Here we go along the west coast. That's where we start to see our blowing snow up towards the Arctic coastline and our falling snow along the west coast, mixing with rain sometimes along the Seward Peninsula and areas near Noatak and south, and then all rain once we get down towards the Aleutian chain. As we get into Thursday afternoon, we can see now that precipitation is spread a little bit farther to the east, and there again is that general trend of those warnings and advisories working their way to the east, blowing snow also spreading eastward. Patchy fog still remaining for southwest and south central Alaska, and then again there's our cold front starting to weaken and slide further to the south for southeast Alaska. For southeast Alaska on Friday, just some high elevation snow showers with this weak system still pushing through. Basically, this is the westerly flow just kind of moving over top of the high pressure, clipping the area with some snow, maybe touching the Copper River Basin, but mostly the Alaska Range. As we get up towards the Arctic coastline, that's where a majority of our weather will be on Friday, looking at the Brooks Range for some blowing snow conditions, and especially in the Barrow-Prudhoe Bay area. High pressure tries to rebuild over southwest Alaska, bringing a day of drying to those folks. And then as we get out over the Bering Sea, our next weather maker already queued up and starting to slide towards western Alaska. Not expected to be very strong, but certainly could produce some more rain and snow for the west coast. How about for temperatures? Well, for our lows on Thursday morning, tomorrow morning, you can see southeast Alaska, that cold offshore flow keeps the skies clear, allows us to radiate out. Expect temperatures mid-20s to low 30s. For the west portion, for the east portion of the state and the higher elevations, you can expect temperatures in the teens and single digits there once you get up towards the Brooks Range. Going to generally be teens along the Arctic coast, and then along the west coast, that's where we have that little bit more of mixed precipitation. Temperatures hovering right around freezing for our lows tomorrow morning, so in the low 30s to maybe upper 20s as you get towards King Salmon. South central Alaska, generally upper 20s, and for the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, mid 30s. For Thursday afternoon, we'll warm things up over southeast Alaska with some sunshine and just windy conditions. Temperatures trying to get to 40. For the eastern portion of the state, generally going to see temperatures in the low to mid upper 20s. And along the coastlines there, still a little bit warmer, low 30s. And towards southwest Alaska, working our way down western Alaska, a little bit of upper 30s and then eventually low 40s towards southwest Alaska. We'll be looking for mid 40s along the Aleutians. For Friday morning, temperatures generally bottoming out in the mid 20s for southeast. We're going to see single digits for the eastern half of the state, while the western half of the state warms up pretty nicely. And then by Friday afternoon, similar conditions with that warm air starting to spread across from southwest to northeast. Still pretty cool in the afternoons for southeast Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look at our aviation forecast now for Thursday and Friday. And as you can see, most of our moisture and activity is going to be confined here along the west coast of Alaska, all the way up to the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea coastline there. And then we do have an area of concern again with that fog and freezing fog, dense at times around the Matanuska and Anchorage Bowl. We do expect that to continue to at least 10 a.m., so pockets of IFR conditions expected with that as well. Otherwise, that moisture pushing up, creating IFR conditions along the west coast, the Seward Peninsula, and even portions of Bristol Bay, where you can expect some dense fog in the morning, and a swath out here over the Aleutian chain. Otherwise, generally surrounded by MVFR conditions. Things looking VFR for southeast Alaska with that strong offshore flow. And as we get into Thursday afternoon, you can see that will continue. And out towards the west coast is where we're going to keep our areas of IFR and MVFR confined. We do start to clear things up, though there could still be some patchy fog around the Anchorage Bowl and the Matanuska Valley. but should start to see things clear up there through the afternoon. And this moisture will slowly slide east, helping to bring those passes down because of a lowering ceiling. So MVFR conditions sliding east by Friday morning, starting to impact rainy and windy. Again, the IFR is going to be right along that warm front, stretching up into the west coast, helping to keep most of the areas right along that boundary. Just a small pocket Friday morning in the Bristol Bay region, and otherwise MVFR conditions along the Arctic coast. Starting to see things slip a little bit farther to the northeast in the Gulf, and by Friday afternoon they pretty much hold steady through the Gulf with VFR conditions expected for southeast Alaska. But as you can see, that MVFR trend continues to the east across much of the interior portion of the state, with the IFR starting to slide a little bit further inland as well, starting to make its way up the Tanana Valley. And as we look at our passes, the Anaktuvik Pass will be visual flight rules becoming marginal visual flight rules. And you'll notice that trend continues with Adigan and Lake Clark and Merrill. It's that moisture works its way to the east. The ceiling should be dropping at Rainy and all the way through Windy Pass as well. Isabel should be further enough to the east that moisture won't make it in there by tomorrow, by Thursday. So thus we expect VFR conditions there. Also for Mentasta, visual flight rules will persist through the day. Tanita will be visual flight rules as well. And it's Portage where we do expect that fog to start the day as instrument flight rules, but then should be improving through the afternoon to visual flight rules. How about Chilkoot and White Pass? Well, they should be visual flight rules with that strong offshore flow. So how about our freezing levels? That's pretty big jump there across much of the interior portion of the state. A little goofy to see the surface line hugging right along the southern boundary of the Gulf, but then 8,000 feet above that. And so what this is telling us is that there's a lot of warm air right off the surface. This helps to create those foggy conditions, sometimes the freezing fog at the surface, but really the warm air can be found up higher aloft. So not expecting a lot of that to mix down or a lot of that to help create icing because of how warm it is aloft. Surface line hugging down along southeast Alaska as well. So what does that mean for our icing? Well, it's going to generally be along that front across the west, above 6,000 feet out here. And as we look out towards the Aleutian chain, above 8,000 feet, a little bit further towards the south. And then the small pocket here, isolated moderate above 4,000 feet along the Brooks Range and hugging up near Barrow. Jet stream is coming in support of this load at about 100 knots, diving from the northwest to the southeast, quickly turns back southwest to northeast at 150 knots. They're a pretty potent jet. And then again, switching directions and diving down again, 110 knots, down to about 80 knots in support of this pretty sharp turn here in the support of this low pressure. The reinforcing piece of the jet streak at 95 knots is helping to keep that strong offshore flow across southeast Alaska, which could make for some gusty winds through those areas. But generally a pretty amplified pattern coming up and down pretty quickly across the state, allowing this area of high pressure to dominate much of the mainland. So that's reflected at 9,000 feet in support of one area of high pressure out over the Bering, bringing winds pretty light and then switching them around to the west and bringing that westerly flow across much of the mainland, 40 to 45 knots there, generally about 15 knots further to the south across the Alaska Range. Our area that we're see the most concern is that quick sharp turn from the west to the north at about 40 knots there, diving out over Dixon Entrance region, is all the way up to 50 knots in some of the stronger areas. And about 3,000 feet, well, similar story with the flow direction and the speeds, 10 knots becoming 20 to 40 knots as you get over the Brooks Range out of the west-southwest, and then generally that north wind between 25, climbing all the way up to 50 knots over southeast Alaska in the southeastern portion of the Gulf. Generally southeast to southwest flow across much of Bristol Bay. So for turbulence, just a small pocket way out there out to the west, and our area of most widespread isolated moderate is below 6,000 feet over southeast Alaska. Stay tuned.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms. Why they occurred, the distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region, the rain-snow line, all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense and what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses, are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. There are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. Well, one of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors: big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to your marine forecast now, and let's get it started with some sea ice. As you can see up here, the sea ice has grown quite a bit since the last time we spoke. Some shore-fast ice east of Barrow stretching out towards Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay now. But with that stronger westerly flow that we expect and some warmer water mixing in here, this will help to compact the marginal edge here, this lighter blue shade that you see. That'll help to compact that, keep the sea ice from growing a whole lot for the next couple days. But as we go into the weekend, we'll see the winds abate, and we'll start to see the colder air settle back in, and that should allow for continued growth once we get past this period of more active weather. So that's the sea ice update. And now for southeast marine forecast, you can see Lynn Canal seeing those strong northerly winds at 30 knots, seas about 6 feet. As you get towards the southern inner waters, northwest winds 25 knots and seas 5 feet. Out over the open waters, northeast coming through the gaps there, 30 to 35 knots and seas 8 to 10 feet, and then a little bit calmer over the northeastern portion of the Gulf, generally a southwest, west, and then eventually a north wind, 15 to 20 knots, seas on the order of 6 feet. As we get into Friday, you can still see that north wind continuing, but it should start to taper off just a little bit, 20 to 25 knots, 4-foot seas, and then down towards the Dixon entrance, Stevens Passage, northwest 20 knots and seas on 4 feet. And up towards the Gulf of Alaska, a little bit more variable winds towards the northern Gulf, 10 to 15 knots and seas 4 feet, and then northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet on Friday. For south central Alaska, pretty variable winds except for out over the Cook Inlet, northerly winds there, 10 knots and seas 2 feet, but otherwise a west and then becoming a southeast and a southwest wind in Prince William Sound, 10 to 20 knots and seas about 5 to 6 feet. On into Friday, keep that northerly flow across Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots and seas 2 to 3 feet. Here's where we start to pick up that northwest through the bays and passes and some of the gaps there of the Barren Islands, 30 knots, seas climbing to 6 to 8 feet. And then northwest and northerly flow out just outside of Prince William Sound and Kayak Island, 15 to 20 knots, 3 to 4 foot seas. Out for the Alaska Peninsula, variable winds for the most part just on the east and southeast side of the peninsula. A little bit more uniform out of the east, 10 knots on the north side, 2 to 5 foot seas there, and seas generally between 4 and 6 feet near Kodiak Island. And keeping that variable trend on into Friday now, confused north of the peninsula, 10 knots and 2 to 4 foot seas, and then generally a westerly wind tries to develop just to the west of Kodiak Island, 15 to 20 knots there, and generally a 3 to 5 foot sea. For the Aleutian chain, you can expect an east wind, a south and east wind on the eastern side of that front, and then a little bit more northerly on the west side of that front. We're going to be between 15 and 20 knots and seas about 6 to 9 feet there. And on into Friday, we can kind of continue that theme of east and southeast, 15 to 20 knots for the eastern Aleutians, 5 to 9 foot seas, and then northwest and north wind, 20 knots, 8 to 9 foot seas out over the western Aleutians. How about for the west coast? Well, you can see a southeast becoming southwest, like we talked about with the sea ice there, 4 to 10 foot seas and generally 15 to 25 knots of wind. And then easterly winds developing just outside of Norton Sound, 10 to 20 knots, and we're seeing seas between 2 and 5 feet. And then more of a south and southeast wind, 15 to 20 knots, seas between 5 and 6 feet. And up along the Arctic coast is where the real active weather will remain. Generally a pretty strong southwest wind here, 45 knots off the coast of Cape Lisburne, and seeing seas anywhere between 6 feet north of Kaktovik all the way up to 15 feet just off the coast there of Point Hope. And we'll see things diminish a little bit off the northwest coast on Friday, but they will pick up north of Kaktovik and Prudhoe Bay. Westerly winds 35 to 40 knots, seas building to 9 to 11 feet. Off the west coast there, seas starting to come down a little bit more in the 5 to 8 foot range. Oh, and I do want to mention for Barrow area, they will be issuing a high surf advisory for Thursday for just specifically for the Barrow area because of those high winds and seas. So recapping the weather, we can see for tonight we do have that moisture starting to work back into western Alaska, and so there's a host of winter storm warnings for the southern slopes of the Brooks Range north of Kaktovik, and winter weather advisories north of the Brooks Range and along the north slopes of the Brooks Range for blowing snow, and then a special weather statement for accumulating snow for ports of Fairbanks and the Alaska Range as we go into the next couple days. So we do have fog continuing for south central Alaska, and the story is going to remain much the same for southeast Alaska with strong, cold offshore winds. Those should diminish some as we go through the next couple days, but the snow will continue for much of northwest and northern Alaska, and that will be the trend on into Friday as that precipitation starts to spread off to the east and a new system develops out over the Bering Sea. Thanks for joining us this evening. Hope you have a great night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.